Ken Carlson. I'll be the moderator for this peer support part of the program. As you can see, we have lots of peer support people here. This presentation will be in 3 separate parts: peer support in the US, peer support in Europe, and peer support for students in training. So I will allow for the panel to introduce themselves and identify which part of the presentation they are doing. Go ahead.
All right. As I previously mentioned when I moderated the panel this morning, my name is Ryan. I'm the Uplift Chair, which is UND's peer support program that we're starting here this fall.
My name is Mark. I am the Vice Chair at Uplift here, so we'll be representing the student training peer support.
My name is Emmy Miller. I helped start Uplift last semester. I graduated in May, and now I work for a drone delivery company called Zipline.
Hi, I'm Adrian Becker from the Center of Aviation Psychology, and I'll be talking about peer support and lessons in Europe, from Europe at least.
I'm Kaylee Trottier. I'm the psychologist, working associate director over at the counseling center right there, and I helped train the peer supporters prior to Ken Carlson getting here, who is currently our embedded aviation psychologist. So just here to answer questions.
I'm Candy Bernsketter. I'm a captain at FedEx, and I am the chair of our pilot peer support program called PATH.
And I'm Chris Georgioulis at NetJets. I am the vice chair of our peer support program called HAWK.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we can go ahead and get started.
But I guess standing right here. So again, I'm Candy. I'll talk a little bit about PATH, just an overview of the program and how it works and what it is, just to give you an idea of what we put together. So I founded the program in 2015. What I did in February 15 was go to Delta's Pilot Assistance Network training. That's their peer support program. And then after that came the big accident in the Alps. Y'all remember the Germanwings accident? And the pilot fitness arc the FAA put together, and I know Quay was on one of the contributors to that. They recommended these pilot peer support programs, so I knew we were headed in the right direction. Right now, I have 13 peers for 5,800 pilots, and that's not a great ratio. We really want 1 to 250 to 300, and I have about 1 to 450. And part of the reason is FedEx did a lot of hiring during COVID. As you can imagine, as a cargo company, we needed pilots, and we weren't able to really do any training or add peers, so it was a difficult time. We're going to fix that next year. So what is a pilot peer support line? It's a 24/7, 365 call center, really, where pilots will be available at any time of the day or night. You never know where a FedEx pilot's going to be in the day or night, but I do want to nip one rumor in the bud. We don't just fly in the middle of the night. I almost exclusively now do daytime domestic flying, but we could be in Germany or in Singapore or in Japan or anywhere in the world, and we have pilots domiciled actually still in Hong Kong as well as Germany. So we need to be available at all times. And we were there to catch all the issues that didn't fit in an already standing ALPA committee. ALPA is our pilot union. And it was things about stress and mental illness. It wasn't professional standards like those other committees we talked about, Quay mentioned before, and it wasn't aeromedical directly, though a little bit could be, but it was all the other nuances. So who we are pilot peers, just like me. We're line pilots, we're not managers. I do have some instructor pilots, but they don't hold a management position, and they really are important to our team, just being there in the training department and seeing how things go in that area. And we talk about ourselves. I ask everyone to call ourselves peers or committee members or PATH members and not use the word counselor or peer counselor. I mean, everybody has heard that term peer counselor, but that implies a level of licensure that, frankly, we don't have. The only license I think we all have is a pilot's license. Right? So how does it work? And please, nobody test the number right now, unless you're a FedEx pilot. Is you call basically our union office. And I kept the number the same because I can't get even pilots to learn that number, and it's really important for them to know that number. And I thought if I did a different number, they'd never make it to make the connection. So we use our number, and even during office hours, a machine first picks up, and it tells you you can press this key for the Aeromedical office in Denver, and Quay and his folks. You can press another key if you'd have an aviation incident or accident and you need our hotline, or you can press another key for the pilot assistance team hotline. When you press that key, it goes to our third-party vendor, a calling service we use, and then they will have the pilot hold on the line where they go down our peer calling list trying to find a peer that's available. So I randomly put the pilots on a call list every month, and they could be at the top or the bottom. Peers only answer when they're available or the call comes in. It's perfectly okay for you to see the call coming in and you, oh, I can't take it, I'm with my kids, I'm in the car. You just let it go to voicemail and the vendor finds the next pilot on the line. So far, we haven't had any real issues with people not answering a call. If for some reason that happens, they will send me a direct email right away. Sometimes it can take a long time to connect, though, and that is one of the downsides. So why do we even need a program like this? And part of it was a lot of the people that need to answer the questions that the pilots have basically work Monday through Friday from like 8:30 to 4 in an office. But what if the question comes up on a Saturday afternoon? What if the pilot's ready to ask for help or is in the middle of their crisis at 11 o'clock at night? And we really needed to be available for all of those situations. And since it's so hard to ask for help, we didn't want people having to wait until Monday morning for the office to open to get their question answered. Right. The best part about it is, as we've talked about earlier, there's no jeopardy in talking to a peer. It's not a reportable event to the FAA, and we are confidential with those caveats that we've talked about earlier as well. So really, it's very basic what we do. Quay also mentioned listening skills are a huge part of our training. We listen, we connect the pilot, and recommend resources and experts to talk to next if that's what they need. And we follow up if it's necessary, and it always isn't necessary. I'm gonna talk a little bit about, in another slide, of what kinds of calls we get. But I wanna say we're a calling in line. Pilots call us. And that's really key. We don't do call out because that means the pilot doesn't have buy-in and they may not talk to us. They might also be mortified if I cold called a pilot and said, oh, hey, here you having a bad day, you want to talk about it? And they'd be like, whoa, who are you and how do you know my business? And it's shut down from the get-go. So it's really important that the pilots call us. We do make exceptions, though, when the pilot either knows we're going to call or it's an urgent or emergency situation when we get together with our team leaders and decide it's necessary for us to bend that rule. So what do you have to know? We've talked a lot about this today as well. Basically, the resources and experts out there that can help the pilot with their next steps. We're there to help the pilot find their way, not to tell them what to do. And I know someone mentioned that earlier as well. I don't tell a pilot what to do next and who to call. I mean, I'll give them a number and make suggestions. But really, we're having them find the pathway to get the answers they need and help solve the issue at hand. And I'm just a peer. I really am truly just a pilot. And I have a lot of knowledge in this area, and I really do know the resources really well for FedEx pilots. I'm not an expert. I can't call myself that. My experts are my benefit specialists. They're my aeromedical office. They're your AME, your personal physician, your mental health professional. Those are the real experts out there that the pilots need to turn to. It's just too hard for me to be an expert in all those areas. I'd never get out of school, for one thing. And since I'm not a licensed professional, again, there's no HIPAA involved or anything like that. So it's really easy to talk to a pilot. But we don't do everything. I don't talk about the contract. I can't interpret the pilot contract for you. You really want to do a legal expert for that. I'm not good at that at all. I'm sorry if you didn't get your catering, and I can't help with that either. But I know where to send those pilots when they kind of get misidentified and sent into our call line, and we certainly do help everyone. And a funny side note, the other day I got a call from a man who said, I did my whole introduction. He apparently didn't listen because he was very stressed. He needed a phone number for a doctor. Like, well, okay, well, who do you need? I'm hearing from my computer. I can help you look it up, because he didn't have internet access. After talking to this man for a few minutes, it was like a who's on first thing. Turns out he randomly called our phone number. He wasn't a FedEx pilot. He was just a patient in a hospital in Houston, and he needed a doctor's phone number. So I looked it up and gave it to him, right? What are you going to do? So types of calls we may get, it runs anything from the gamut to I need the phone number to the aeromedical office. I think, Quay, I give your phone number out most of all, your office number, to needing mental health help, to I just got a new prescription, what do I do, taking calls about your Med Express and how do I fill things out on there. There's just really too many to list. But again, we're a great clearinghouse, let's just say, a resource center for pilots to call when they really don't know who else to call, because we'll help them find the information they need. And just one final thought, we're just one tool in the toolbox. When Craig listed all those other support committees a lot of us have at our airlines, and a lot of you all have here as students at your university, we're just one more layer in that safety Swiss cheese. You guys ever seen that in your classes? They put a gigantic things of Swiss cheese, and you see the hole in the cheese, and they, you can't get through the cheese by the end if there's a bunch of slices, and we're just one of those slices blocking, the pilot from getting through to where the danger zone is. So we're just a tool for the pilot group. And I'm going to hand it off to my counterpart here.
Thank you, Candy. Try not to repeat too much. A lot of these programs are very similar. We did a lot of work with SOAR when we established our program. As we all know, that we aren't qualified to treat Charlie. He's pretty much needs a whole team of actual therapists. But this is a fun little video, but we won't do that. Okay, we formally established our program in 2019. I was one of the initial cadre of peer support volunteers. Most of us came from the CERP committee, Critical Incident Response, so we were used to talking to people who maybe had traumatic experiences or things that happened at work in the aircraft. I don't know why it's automatically clicking here. Can I pause this? There we go. Anyway, we spooled it up in 2019. And a couple things one thing that's a little bit different than some of the other programs is NetJets itself is actually bought in financially to our program. They help pay for a lot of the training and also some of the mental health therapist costs. Also, it's a selling point. Of course, the company's involved because of safety, but also it's a good selling point for our passengers and our owners. This is pretty much repeat stuff. Our hotline is handled a little bit differently. We have a call comes to your personal phone. We use Vonage to set that up, and essentially, it's a 24/7, and it's one number that people can call, and then somebody will answer. If you happen to be in the shower or driving or something, you can't answer the phone, then it'll go to your email, and you'll get a voicemail to your email. Another aspect that's a little bit different, we do some outreach. We try to focus on the incoming calls. As Candy said, that's more effective. We do outreach based on other committee referrals usually, and there'll be a slide here down the line that'll show that. So that is a little bit different with our program. This is a basic structure of our HAWK program. Basically, the CEO and our union president are at the top, and then we have a governance board. It's me and Kim Talor, who's our chairperson, and then we have an HR and a flight ops specialist that's in the governance board. Jessica Oslander is our mental health professional, and we do collaborate with her, and she comes to our monthly meetings. Yeah, she's amazing. This is our goals, pretty straightforward. The proactive outreach part really comes from our stewards a lot, maybe from the training department with people that are having some issues, things like that. One thing that we do stress with all of our PSVs is to log all the calls. NetJets is a very metric-driven company, and if they're paying for something, they want to know the data. So that's pretty much where that call log comes into play. It's de-identified. It's basically what kind of call was it, when, where does a person live, that comes into play whenever we're trying to hook them up with a mental health professional. This is what it's not. Candy already said these. I'm a pilot. I'm not a mental health professional. The workflow, just a couple things on here. we try to monitor what work goes to which peer support volunteer and not to overload them. Burnout is a thing with this stuff, and we like to try to equally distribute the cases. Also, we're working on giving a couple months off per year to our PSVs. Right now, we have 13, we have 2,800 pilots. Our goal is 1 PSV per 250. What else was on here? So this is our call log. This is the de-identified questions that we fill out. Types of issues, they pretty much line up with what Candy already said. We developed this quick reference card. Pilots can relate to that for our peer support volunteers. It has probably 90% of the calls that come in, referral numbers, committees, names, resources. So, you know, we have that available when the call comes in. So these are all the committees that kind of interact with our Health and Wellness Committee. Like I said, the stewards on top, they pretty much get a lot of calls from people, especially when they're on the road, that are having issues. We have the, what else is, the PAP and FDAC. So PAP is our HIMSS program, essentially. And Fitness for Duty is what the FDAC is. We work with them a lot. And there's the CERP committee up on the other side. And of course, the legal and the flight department. So we kind of interact with all those other committees whenever issues come up with our pilots. So that's a general overview, and looking forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Adrian Becker. I'm the co-founder for the Center of Aviation Psychology, and you may have gathered from my accent, I'm not from these parts. And the fact that I thought there was only one fork in Grand Forks is an indication to the fact that I haven't been here before, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's fair to say that this time, several months ago, I had no idea I'd be spending this part of November in this beautiful part of the world, so thank you. It's in all seriousness, I come from a small country where everything is 2 hours away, so to be in such a vast part of the world is an absolute delight, so thank you for the invitation. Oops, not looking so good. Just to say that I am the co-founder and stockholder of the Center for Aviation Psychology, and you'll be no fear of me talking about off-label prescriptions on this presentation. The Center for Aviation Psychology, effectively, we're psychologists by profession, clinical psychologists working in the world of aviation, and that makes us a fairly scarce and unique resource. And almost by accident, we became specialists in peer support, and that was primarily because we were working with 1 or 2 airlines at the time of the Germanwings incident, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And very quickly there was this dawning realization that peer support is a good thing, primarily because it is a good thing, and secondly because it's going to be, or was going to be, a compliance requirement across Europe. So in a very short space of time, we had multiple companies approach us and say, hey, we know nothing about peer support. Can you help us put it together? And we said, hey, we know nothing about peer support either, but we can certainly make a start. And so very quickly, we educated ourselves and got ourselves thinking through the issues with regards to peer support. And it turns out it's basically very good psychology. It's the obvious stuff. It's making psychology accessible and lowering and removing the barriers as quickly as possible to those who need it most. It's obviously a little bit more complex than that, as you've gathered through the course of the day. But in that time, we now support sort of over 27,000 pilots across Europe and well over 100 airlines. And trust me, however big or small those airlines are, and some of them only, when I say airlines, commercial aviation operations, some of them only have 2 pilots, and that can be as complex as those who have 2,000 or 10,000. Each are quite different and unique in their own lovely way, like children or grandparents or parents for that matter. And each have their own demands, and each are fascinating. What's been interesting to me, as you can see, we work in lots of different countries and in lots of different languages. And we started off with the big companies, the British Airways, the EasyJets, the Swiss, the TAPS, big in European standards, not in the US, of course, not quite that big, but we're sort of dealing with thousands of pilots. And in many ways, that's easier to deal with because you're dealing with departments, you're dealing with safety representatives, and so on. And very quickly, we discovered that there are whole sectors of aviation that have been left out and forgotten about. And here's a shout out to those in the business aviation market. Turns out business aviators are definitely the forgotten children in the regulatory world. And if you think they've forgotten about, well, the rotary wing operators are certainly very much forgotten about. So very quickly, we started to develop peer support programs and adapt our model to suit them. And it's been fascinating understanding the pressures and stresses that aviators from such a diverse range of industries face. So the pressures that a rotary wing single operation pilot may face may be quite different to something of an international long-haul operator. So nonetheless, we got working, and over a period of time, very quickly, a lot of the operators said to us, well, if this is good for pilots, maybe it's good for the other parts of the operation. And we said, yeah, absolutely, we would be happy to work with that. And gradually, we've been starting to engage cabin crew and maintenance. We call them engineers. I think you call them mechanics. But the whole engineering operation, the behind the scenes, the safety critical envelope is just as important to support. And interestingly, the airlines have been working with, they were saying, this stuff is good, but we should have been taught this in flight school. We should have had access to this in flight school. And we said, we agree, you need flight school. So we spoke to some flight schools, and they weren't interested. And this is in Europe mostly. And I say that flippantly in the sense that it isn't a regulatory requirement. And a lot of those flight schools are very, very cost conscious. And it obviously came at a bad time, just around COVID time or so. And they were saying, it sounds great, but it's going to cost money, and we can't afford to put our fees up for our students and so on. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be here, because I actually think this is where it really starts. And I think UND has taken leadership, and I know there are other colleges here as well, and I think this is fantastic. If you start here, you're going to reap the dividends. So the industry is going to reap the dividends for many generations to come. Interestingly, some of the flight schools that we contacted, they said, yeah, the problem with our population, unlike the airlines that you support, is that the students keep leaving. You know, they graduate and they move on. So if we keep training them as peers, they're going to keep leaving, and we're going to have to keep training them. I said, yeah, that's generally the idea of a school, is you share the skills and you move on, and you get into this notion of having to do the same class every year. And actually what we found is that for a lot of the peers that have worked for us, these are skills that they've valued, and they get a tremendous amount out of peer support. So actually these are great skills that for peers who are involved, these are great skills for them to have, let alone the great service they will do to their colleagues. So for most of you, we've been referring all day to Germanwings, and I appreciate. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who said, "Just tell me what happened with Germanwings again. I know it was a big deal, but so what was it? You know, what actually happened?" And without getting into any of the gory details, for those of you who aren't aware, Germanwings is sort of a huge event in our industry. This was an incident where a first officer deliberately locked the captain out of the flight deck and then deliberately flew their airplane into the Swiss Alps, killing all on board. Very tragic accident, and through the investigations, many things were revealed, but one of the things revealed was obviously there's a strong mental health component here. The deep, tragic sense of irony here is that this person actually had access to peer support. We'll never know why he never accessed it, and it's also a salutary reminder of a number of things. Firstly, that peer support isn't a guarantee, as some of our clients think. It's not a guarantee that all of a sudden you won't have an issue with serious mental health issues. It is, just as somebody was saying, it's just one of many avenues and resources for people to access. And the other thing that it did is really just open the Pandora's box on pilot well-being. You know, it turns out, who would have believed, pilots are human just like everybody else, as we've been discussing, and they are exposed to the same pressures and strains that we've all been discussing every day. And so consequently, by opening this conversation up, the regulator in Europe, it's called EASA, came out with a set of regulations which makes it quite unique around the world. And those regulations listed over there, I won't go through all of them, but this was a sense that every operator had to have these practices in place. And so in Europe, there are, I think, 800 to 1,000 registered airlines. of different shapes and sizes, as I was saying, and they were saying that actually you need to have this, and it is far more complex than this. That last one, just by the way, the AMEs in the Class 1 medicals, when you're going for your, the conversation we had earlier on, when you're going for your annual medical, they now have to include the assessment of mental health, and that has caused absolute pandemonium in terms of, well, actually this was hard enough. AMEs establishing a relationship with a pilot they haven't seen for a year. Now all of a sudden I'm going to need to start really digging into mental health issues. But luckily that's not what I'm going to talk about, because that's a conference that lasts several days on its own. The access to pilot peer support is such a big deal, because that actually now means that every single pilot across Europe has access to a peer support program that's been mandated. And that is the big difference between Europe and obviously here in the US or in North America, well, and the rest of the world for that matter. And there's a good debate to be had, is the regulation a good thing? Because really what you want, and the regulators would say, I guess the FAA would say, is less regulation the better, because there's less auditing, there's less sort of burden on the airlines. We'd rather hope the airlines would do this, the operators would do this, because this is just a good thing to do. It's good practice. And of course that's true, and many of those people who believe in that are here today. Interestingly for us though, we came across a whole bunch of operators who didn't have a view whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. This was just something that they had to do. And as a result of, actually because of the timing of that, during COVID, tens of thousands of pilots had access to peer support programs that they wouldn't otherwise have had access to, and obviously made use of that. So what's been interesting about the impact that this has had overall, the one I've just spoken about, it's clearly on the agenda. Mental health is something that we all talk about now. It's no longer a difficult conversation to have. It's also meant that we start talking about, airlines, this is really more at the, and when I say airlines, any institution involved in aviation, at a management level, it's now on risk registers. People are now saying, actually, we have to think about the health and well-being of our employees, and it is a potential risk for us to manage. And I forget who mentioned earlier on today, they had a director of health and well-being on their board, which was great to have. The other aspect, and forgive me for those of you who've heard me say this, because I do sort of tend to preach on about this, is what's been interesting about the imperative, the regulatory requirement in Europe about needing mental health access to peer support programs, is that because it's a compliance requirement, it's no longer a nice to have. And every organization will say, well, I've got a whole long list of nice to haves and we've got limited resources. But actually now we have to have it because we've got to tick a box, and if we're going to tick a box, we might as well make sure that it adds value to our operation. And that's a whole different dynamic that we get into. We spoke about extending this to other parts of aviation, not just pilots, and I think certainly in Europe, that's been the next wave. There's a review going on about how successful this has been, with a view to now extending it to cabin crew, and certainly that will include the ATOs and so on. But I have to say, I'm not a big fan. I'm a psychologist. I don't like regulation. I hate rules, like I suppose all the rest of us do. However, I would say, and clearly I have a vested interest here, so I do declare that, but I would say that this is the one aspect of regulation that has been the least controversial of all those regulatory requirements I've put up. It's been a no-brainer, and it's gone down exceptionally well in the sense of being value added. So when we look at the core aspects of this, and we've had some great conversations and presentations today about really what you need, so I'll go through this very quickly. The first thing for us is that however you configure it, and you've heard some fantastic examples, it's got to be accessible to pilots. Pilots need to be able to think, this is something for me. And what was interesting about today's conversation right at the start, which was very good, it was illuminating to me to understand how the special issuances are processed here in the US. However, I suspect a lot of pilots would be thinking, boy, I better think twice before, I really think about this carefully before I start sort of approaching anybody in an official capacity. Because for a lot of pilots, there is, well, anybody for that matter, I'll speak for myself, if I approach somebody formally and there's the slightest whiff of jeopardy about it, that I might lose something that I value greatly, I'm going to think twice about that. I'm going to do a lot of soul searching. I'll probably start off by trying to ignore and hope the problem goes away. And then I'll probably Google it a bit, and then get myself really freaked out. And then what I'll do is I'll probably speak to somebody I trust. and then I might consider seeing somebody in a more professional setting. And it's great to hear that actually there's human thought and process around this when you do approach the AMEs. And generally my experience of AMEs, as exactly Dr. Snyder said, find yourself a good AME, because my experience has been good AMEs are absolutely fabulous in the way that they've been described. But generally to get to that point, especially when there's a mental well-being issue, I'm not thinking particularly rationally at that point. For me, my whole career is going up in flames. I can just hear the bank knocking on my door. They're going to take away everything I own. I'm dramatizing, and things aren't going so well. So to get a sense of proportion and perspective is super important. And generally, hopefully, I'd get that from somebody I love and trust. But sometimes the issue is so great that I'm actually too ashamed to turn to that person for whatever reason, or it might be with those people directly. And that's obviously why peer support is worth its weight in gold. On an organizational level, I won't spend too much time talking about it, but you do want to think about how it's set up. All organizations are different. The way you set it up, how you delegate responsibilities, and there are a lot of responsibilities that go with it. On the face of it, it sounds pretty straightforward, but there's some stuff you need to think through fairly carefully, especially about the exciting stuff such as data protection and indemnity insurance and so on. Now, this is an interesting bit, the risk versus return on investment. We heard earlier on about at NetJets, and it's not just NetJets. Every organization we've been in will say, well, we're a metric-driven organization, so we want to see some hard metrics. I said, well, you only employ 3 pilots, so it's quite likely that it'll be a while before one of them use it. And if they do use the service, we ain't going to tell you about it. So those are difficult conversations to have. But interestingly, we've never really had any pushback from the accountants, or as the term being used in the trade, the bean counters, the people who are sort of the mythical ogres who just say no. What was the question? In actual fact, often they see the sense and the value proposition in this, because as soon as they start realizing that peer support is about saving careers, if not lives. It's about getting ahead of a problem upstream so that it doesn't become a bigger problem downstream, because there's nothing more expensive than a pilot who's gone on long-term sick, or worse, a pilot who leaves their career earlier than they should, or and consequently the retraining, the rehiring process, and worse even still. So actually, the cost equation is a pretty easy one to have, easy one to prove. I'll move on quickly. I again won't spend too much time on this, but in terms of the core responsibilities that peer support program coordinators have, on the face of it, how hard can it be? Recruit some peers, train them up, give them some support on their way. And in essence, peers are the most important part of this equation to build this trust. So there's absolutely no doubt that is the most important bit. But there's quite a bit underneath it that one needs to think through in terms of the processes, the due governance, the escalation, the insurances that you need to have in place, and so on. It's not rocket science. It's not something that none of you are capable of doing. You probably do things far more complex in a far more complex way in your operation. It's just got to be thought through. And from that perspective, those who do it well have actually got through this process pretty painlessly. But you do need to do this and document it. So in terms of the typical challenges that we've seen, as you can obviously work out, you need to figure out how you want to do this, how you're going to get your governance and your independence proven to yourselves, let alone to those who are going to be using the service. And most importantly on that point is, how do you embed this into the organization in a way that it actually sort of builds trust in that pilot community, because that's really, really difficult. We spoke about the wider ecosystem of resources, and what struck me particularly here at UND, and hopefully this is true at a lot of other colleges of a similar ilk, is the incredible access to resources for support that's available to students. What's interesting for us, though, one of the things that you'll see that really sort of gets us to what works best about the good practice that we've seen. And we've seen some great practice, and these are with clients that, these are our clients. We've seen some clients who've really embraced this and made this work. And we've seen some clients who've sort of taken it on, ticked the box, and done the least that we've asked them to do. And it hasn't given them quite what they thought it would do, primarily because of these things. They've not hardwired it into their organization. They've not looked at where are all the stress points. We talked about check rider-itis. Sim anxiety is no laughing joke for those who, from what I gather, who are pilots. One of the things I've heard that when a pilot retires, one of the biggest relief that they have is that they no longer have to do check rides. And that's a sad state of affairs if you spend your whole career dreading every 6 months, but that's the reality of your industry. But what's interesting about this, and the reason I mention it, is that the training community often, especially in big airlines, often have more contact with pilots than their management do. So pilots' experience of an organization is often mediated through the training community. And if you have one bad check ride, as we heard earlier on, I thought that was, I think, Eric, it was a great sort of anecdote to start their presentation. One bad check ride can blight a career for many, many years to come, if not ruin it. So in many ways, I suppose the thing to say before I go is, I really appreciate that we're probably preaching to the converted here, but this is definitely a worthy, it's a value-added proposition, not just on every metric that you could think of on an organizational level, but most importantly on a human level. And this is the most satisfying thing that hopefully the peers, for those of you who are peers around and those of you in the caring and supportive professions, to help somebody through their time of need, however large or small it is a rare, rare honor. And to see them come through the other side, there are a few things that will give you a greater buzz out of that. So, and I really want to pay homage to all those peers who make this possible. Most, if not all of them, do it on a voluntary basis. And discretionary effort is a very rare thing to come by. People put themselves out to help each other, and often they do it for very deep personal reasons. They know what it was like to be in a time of need, and I want to pay homage to those peers. And the last thing to say is just thank you to all of you, and particularly to Beth and to the Dean and to the peers, the Uplift peers as well, for being here and engaging this and inviting me to come and talk here. So thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and talk about how Uplift got started, starting last semester. So I attended the Aviation Mental Health Summit last December, and at the end of that day, we all sat down and talked about things we could actually put into action rather than just talking about it. And peer support programs were the #1 item. So that was our key takeaway. We talked with a lot of leaders from airline and Air Force peer support programs, so they really helped us put this together. So the framework for Uplift started out, we needed a third party to keep kind of the leadership separate so that students wouldn't be worried about any trust issues. So we have our embedded aerospace psychologist, Dr. Carlson, leading it. And students can reach out to their peers online through a third party website hosted by CAP. And peers can provide resources to students, but not professional help. So peers are meant to be, pointing students to the resources that they need, but not to replace a psychologist or counselor if they need that. In terms of recruitment, we started that mid-spring last semester. We posted a bunch of posters around campus. We had videos on social media. We wanted to target all of the aerospace majors, a lot of different grade levels, just the diverse student body. We aimed for about 15 peers based on ratios that the U.S. Air Force Academy uses, but we did have a lot of applications that we weren't quite expecting just because it was a brand new thing. And our minimum requirements, you had to start at least your second year at UND by this fall. You had to be in good academic standing just to make sure that students weren't already putting too much on their plate, that they had time to be peers. And you had to be a declared aerospace major so that you were actually a peer of the students you were helping. And our process was an online application. You just filled out a couple questions about yourself through a Qualtrics survey. You said like a little essay about why you want to be a peer. You gave some references. And then we had names screened by faculty just to make sure that people actually were what they said they were, in good academic standing. Maybe professors actually recommended these students. And then myself and a few other students interviewed them through Zoom over the summer to select them finally.
All right, and I just want to touch on, this is where kind of Emmy's journey ends with the program because she actually graduated. So this speaks to kind of a unique individual challenge that we have from a collegiate peer uplift standpoint, is that we only have 2-3 years max before we move on to industry or we move on outside the university, because this is really intended for students by students. So speaking to the support of the UND administration and our embedded psychologists in UND Counseling Center, this would not be possible without them at all, for a number of reasons. One, we're still developing ourselves. We're 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and we need some way to retain the institutional memory of how do we actually process these cases and how do we move on when we get stuff that we don't know how to deal with as adolescents ourselves. So the training that we did was overseen by the Unity Counseling Center. So Kaylee oversaw us, and we did a lot of training that was emphasized. Actually, Quay talked in his keynote quite a bit about how we're not professionals. We don't give diagnosis. We listen to peers and we provide support as possible. And this symposium itself has been super helpful for me because I know in the future I can provide resources to people in need, and I know kind of better to navigate the SI system and where students should go should they have mental health questions. So a lot of scenario-based training. We did some role-playing as well, just kind of get students in the groove of giving peer support because a lot of us haven't done this before. This is all brand new for us. So we use that ALGE method, which is approach, listen, give, encourage, professional help, and encourage other support strategies as well. So very non-judgmental approach, a non-diagnosis approach. We are just peer supporters, and kind of that's where we left it as. And another thing we also talked about was what are some appropriate escalation criteria. So when do we actually need to go and seek help from our professional psychologists and our embedded psychologists as to, maybe a student is having a crisis that, as students ourselves, we're not really equipped to deal with. So providing some background into how Uplift came about, after that late summer, early fall period, we held meetings with several of the industry partners who have programs like this, and we got kind of a collection of ideas from them how to best implement a peer support program to a university setting. And we kind of heard of two approaches. One was, a very hotline, very pilot-centric approach, and another, as put forward by the Center for Aviation Psychology, which was, a little bit more organized, a little bit more structured, a little bit more friendly to the peer system. So what we had decided is students who request or need peer support would basically go onto our website, fill out this form. We had some design criteria as well. We wanted that ease of access to be as low as possible. So any college student should be able to go onto a form and fill out, 5 or 6 fields. You just need your phone number, your name. It doesn't even have to be a real name. And then a deadline for us to get back to you. So we wanted it to be timely, but this wasn't really a crisis resource. We have a UND Counseling Center for that. And if students have a genuine crisis that they need solved, they're kind of redirected towards the UND Counseling Center, who are better equipped to deal with those crisis situations. So why did we pick this approach? For a number of reasons. One, this is a student peer support program, so we're all full-time students. A lot of us work part-time jobs in conjunction with full-time college classes. We don't always have the time to carry around a hotline with us, and we're not always well-equipped to have those really intense conversations off the fly like that, just answering a phone. So we decided on this system to give students kind of the prep time to deal with those, maybe seek some professional help if we need help before we engage those students again, and have those conversations that we need to have. So it's still a timely system, so we have a 24-hour and a 48-hour option where we'll get back to you via text, and then we'll set up a time to call so both parties are ready to talk, about the issues that they have. So kind of a balancing act, if you will, between, ease of access and quality of support as well. So that's what it looks like from the student perspective. And then going over to our peer side utilization, this is just a screen cap from kind of what does it look like from our side when we see someone submit that form. So we have the ability to pick up cases, transfer cases, to people who are share a little bit more in common. So, touching on that, like LGBTQ plus, like if someone wants to talk to someone from that community, we can transfer them over. Or maybe they have a major that's more applicable to that situation. We'll transfer them over to an ATC major, for instance, because they share a lot of the same problems. So we kind of gave that capacity as well. And we also do have the capacity to keep records, though our peers have been trained, to de-identify everything, make sure that we're giving proper records, just so we have it from a data standpoint, and we can use that to improve our peer support program in the future. None of this is, obviously it's all de-identified. We don't keep track of specifics, but we do like to keep track of, all right, how often is this service being utilized and what type of problems are we running into for the service, so we can further training going forward and keep kind of improving the service as we keep going. So we also have the capabilities to refer cases, so we can refer cases directly to our embedded aviation psychologist, Dr. Ken Carlson, as well. So that's kind of what the peer support program looks from our side. Of any students who are, in the audience and they're looking at creating a peer support program themselves, this is kind of our solution. I wouldn't, necessarily recommend it as a one-size-fits-all, but that's kind of what we came up with, and we're excited to see how it's utilized in the future.
I thought that was a wonderful presentation. Thanks to our students. They really did run this program. They initiated it, they started it. Beth, of course, was one of a primary forces as well. And once you get her started, it's hard to stop her. So you guys did an excellent job. The only thing as far as training that I would add is MHFA. We decided from the counseling perspective to go with MHFA because it is something that already existed, and I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. It's a great program, basic first aid skills from a psychological perspective. The second day, we spent a lot more time doing some role playing using those skills, as well as training peers in the CSSRS. I would say that was something that was near and dear to me as far as suicide prevention. We can talk about the soft skills and the listening and the validating, but if people aren't prepared to ask hard questions, we may drop balls, and that's a really huge opportunity for organizations to have Swiss cheese, right, moments. And I think at the end of the day, we just kind of set up some more policies and procedures. Other than that, that's all I have to say.
Well, one of the things that wasn't mentioned is their foresight in setting this up so they can ensure some element of continuity. So he will graduate. He will be next in line for this seat. Someone will take his place. And they were very wise to do that, honoring the fact that as an institution, we're looking for people to fly away. And that, I think, was very wise on their part. In addition, I think a lot of accolades to them. I've spent only a little bit of time with them so far, but I can tell you I'm very impressed with their level of maturity and commitment to this process. Anyway, are there any questions for anyone here regarding what you've heard?
Talk to me. So when you get a request, does one of you guys triage those requests, or does it the next in queue that one of the peer?
Yeah, so it's all automated. So the way that they've set it up is that once someone submits a request, we all get notification that a request has been submitted. If no one picks it up after a period of time, we get another notification, and we keep getting increasing notifications until someone picks up that case. So that's kind of how we're notified as to incoming cases.
Second question, more.
And I was going to say, I'm told, I trust the program, but if the students don't pick it up, the embedded psychologist or whoever's overseeing it will get an email saying that this case hasn't been picked up yet.
Question for the whole group. This includes airlines. In one of your presentations about you had that structure, which I appreciated from being in the military, and peer pilots could talk to maybe one of the psychologists, and that was obviously more like an informal type of. Has there been concerns that pilots have raised about confidentiality not being followed, and how do you deal with that, or how do you allay those fears in an organization?
I mean, our peer program not keeping confidentiality?
Correct. Like one of the peer pilots inadvertently disclosing something to a company leader, God forbid, one of the psychologists, but sometimes a peer pilot may not follow. All systems are prone to human error, right? People violating rules. Confidentiality gets violated in the medical world. So I'm just curious how that's dealt with, if it has occurred, and even if it hasn't occurred, a pilot raises that as an issue. How do you allay those fears within an organization, especially if it's a company, they work for the company?
Well, so far, 7 years in, I haven't heard anything like that, nor has anyone come to us with that. And it is so important for us to keep that reputation and that level. I mean, I did such a short overview of our program with the confidentiality, and of course the caveats do that. But we don't do email because it's discoverable, even if you delete it, things like that. Now I can send an email saying, hey, call me, I have a case, or about you, and then we get express permission to talk to other people on behalf of the pilot. In general, we want the pilot to make the next calls, but if I want to consult with somebody, I get explicit permission. Hey, is it okay if I talk to Chris about that and get back with you? And we get that kind of permission. I haven't had that issue, so I don't know how we haven't had to deal with it.
Sure.
But it is so important, and we start from day one, minute one, with our peer training, talking about the reputation of the program and the confidentiality. And I think it so far so good. It speaks for itself.
Yeah, I'll just add, somebody mentioned, that might have been Quay, about trust. This program is really founded on trust. And whenever we train our PSVs, one of the first things we tell them to say is about confidentiality. This is between you and I. It doesn't go anywhere unless you want it to. As far as the MHP referrals go, you try to bring them to make that decision on their own, with very little pushing and once they do, obviously, you're bringing somebody else into the fold.
Sure.
But it should be their choice.
If I could just add on to that, I mean, obviously, just to reiterate everything that's been said, I mean, but it starts right at the beginning of selection and then training. I mean, by the time you get through any training, you would certainly understand the role of confidentiality and how important that is. And the great thing about working with people in aviation, particularly with pilots, they understand rules and processes, and they understand this is a fundamental part of the process. So it's never been an issue for us, although, of course, that's the biggest risk that we have, is inadvertent disclosure, exactly as you described. We also do in airlines, or any institution for that matter, is very quietly and gently remind them of their data protection responsibilities as an employee of the company, that they're dealing with personal and confidential information, and that if they were to breach it, they would be held accountable for that. But that is a delicate one, because I think at the time of doing the training, everybody's wanting to do the right thing, but it does just help focus the mind that personal information is a very precious commodity to have.
Thank you.
Well, just real quick, you don't have to identify yourself when you call our path line. We don't give out proprietary information, so you don't have to tell me who you are. But in general, pilots, and a lot of our pilots are from the military. I get name, rank, and serial number. I'm Bob Smith. I'm a captain in Indianapolis. I fly this Boeing 767. My employee number is this. Okay, and none of that's necessary or required. So I let the pilot also decide the level of anonymity.
Sure.
And speaking from the Uplift side, because this is so new at UND and kind of in this general area, we had a conversation with all the peer supporters that, we know it's probably going to be slow going, right? And we know we have to build that institutional trust. So if we get one case and we do well in that one case and we really help someone who needs help, they're going to go tell their friends, right? And that is how we grow this program. But on the flip side, that can also be a detriment, right? If one of us does something that is not what we say we're going to do, for example, we're not going to call someone back like was mentioned earlier, or we're not doing some things that really should be done, that gets out very quickly, right? It's spreading that wildfire. So as far as I'm aware, all of us have understand that responsibility, and that responsibility is on our shoulders, right? Because if we don't do something the way that we're supposed to be doing it, it's going to quickly crush the credibility of this program. And we all believe that this program is essential here at UND, right? So as soon as we do something that kind of is detrimental to that program, there's kind of that in the back of our minds as well.
Sure. In working with emergency room staffs, I've often reinforced the 110-100 rule, and that is what you're saying, Mark. If you do a good job or you do a bad job with one person, they tell 10 people. Those 10 people tell 10 people. Now, you may have messed up one time, but 100 people now know not to go there. And so you have to be very careful. And it's imperative that confidentiality be honored, and that's why we have 3 separate layers of confidentiality built into this program, starting with a confidentiality agreement that's quite detailed, that was supplied by the Center for Aviation, that each of the peers will sign. Then the person can identify anonymously. All records are anonymous. So there are 3 different layers.
I think the other thing that we talked, the bigger breaches of confidentiality, we all understand those are more intentional, but the inadvertent, we had a conversation about inadvertent even behaviors and trust, right? The language we use. If I go into the classroom and I'm like, some guy called last night and he's an alcoholic and he drinks all the time, right? Like, what if the person next to you has an alcohol problem? Is he going to trust your program? Is he going to call? It's, you didn't call out the person, but it was a trust breach, right? So the language we use when it comes to substance use disorders or suicide, right? That's all important, and that can all be divulging. You're now a peer supporter within the program. Do you let the students, do you meet them in a coffee shop, right? Do you let the students know that if they come talk to you, there may be people that make assumptions about that, right? And I think that's for each student to decide where they're comfortable with divulging. They're not HIPAA bound, but it is a conversation worth having.
Sure.
Just to piggyback on Dr. Dan's, because I can't say your last name, I do apologize. I'm curious. It works until it doesn't work. So when it doesn't work, who is liable? God forbid things should happen. I'm just curious. Could someone speak to that?
Do you guys want to pick that up? Yeah, it's a good question. So liability obviously is a complex and thorny issue. And I think where you run into legal problems is if you've got bad processes in place or you haven't followed the processes you have got in place. So if you end up making a bad call but you followed good process, you're standing on a better defense than if you've got no process at all. I think in terms of liability, it's important that the most important thing is that the peers are protected. So generally speaking, the peers are typically covered by the indemnity insurance of either the employer or the supervising mental health professional, however it's constructed. And it's a good question because it's something you have to be aware of. I'm not aware of any instance in which a peer has been taken to task, but it also raises another important topic is that of consent. I think one of the key aspects of anybody using the service or anybody providing the service is you need to have a way of demonstrating that the person gave you consent. And part of that consent is to say that there will be certain occasions I may need to reveal your identity. And so that the person provides knowing consent, informed consent is the word I'm looking for. And that's quite a big deal. And that's why on our websites and on the contact forms, when they push the submit button, they have an opportunity to confirm that, they can only submit the form by saying, I admit to the terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions, when they click on it, it's not 60 pages of software update terms and conditions. It's 5-6 key points that are fairly self-evident. So that's why we're so keen to have it sort of a website-based service from that perspective.
I just want to add to that. When I work in the CSS or suicide prevention, I've been getting that question a lot from the law school, is if we train people to ask, oh, what are your thoughts about killing yourself? Where's our liability? I can only speak for myself and as a psychologist, but I go back to doing the right thing is also an important part of this equation, right? Within the scope of practice and the scope of your training. Like, I'm not going to perform heart surgery on someone because that I should be held liable for that. But just ignoring the problem and pretending like you didn't just say you're really sad and thinking about not being here tomorrow, that's not the answer either. So is it possible a lawyer might have some questions for me for asking someone? But I also know, according to the research, that is the right thing to do within my process, within my scope of practice. So I think we just try to do the right thing within the scope that we're trained in.
Right. And each of the peers have my phone number and have been invited to contact me at any time with any question. So I think that's a piece for them, and certainly falls on the embedded psychologist position to monitor. The terms
Associate Director at Counseling Center is a backup for that embedded psychologist as well.
Yes. Oh, trust me, they'll hear about it. But the terms and conditions submit form is short but very to the point, and I think answers exactly the question that you have. I invite for you to access the website, even though it's not up and running, but will be by the end of the conference as an advance notice. And look at those terms and conditions because they also outline the terms and conditions under which we will breach confidentiality.
I'm a fellow student, and we're looking at ways for, students to support other students, within our university. One of the biggest things that we've run into when we're looking at this is how do we support the peer, the peer support people themselves. Like, obviously they're answering these calls, they're doing these calls. I mean, we're students, we don't have a lot of life experience. If I answer a call and someone's like, my dad just died, I'm gonna be like, sorry, I got nothing for you. Like and that is now a burden that I carry, within myself. How are we supporting these people that are, trying to support other people? How do we fill their buckets to make sure that our peers are supported?
Yeah, so that speaks to the necessity of having an embedded aviation psychologist with us. They're supporting us. I mean, we have him on speed dial. So if we really have a question or if we really can't deal with, a mental health crisis, we go to the professionals because, I've just turned 21, he's 20, so we don't have the life experience yet to deal with these issues. This is where a trained professional comes in.
Can I just say something in defense of yourselves and your age is, you don't need to have life experience to be supportive of somebody going through a crisis. So you'll have many of our peers and peers who may be slightly older than 21, who've been around for a long time. They'll be dealing and supporting pilots who are going through life experiences those peers have never had. So the core skills that you need, it's competency-based rather than task-based. The core skills you need are active listening and empathy. And if you've got those, and those aren't defined by age, by the way, you can have them at a very young age or not, and at a very old age or not. And I'm sure we've all come across people, if you're on pilot in the left seat, and if you're in the left seat, it's the right seat, or whichever seat it is, who've lacked those skills. And then those who have those skills, and what a big difference that makes. So even if you don't have those life experience, and by the way, that sort of feeling of what do I say next, that doesn't go away with years of experience. You have that feeling all the time, but it is embracing and leaning into that anxiety of, I don't want to make this worse, but actually what this person needs most is for me to listen to them. And once you've mastered that, then you can deal with almost anything that comes your way.
This is my position that I'll be talking to the peers about next time I meet with them. But I think what people need when they access a line like this one, a peer support, is compassion. And compassion is an element of a combination of sympathy, I feel for you, and empathy, I feel with you. And having a peer that you call as a fellow student or a student who's sharing a common experience, you can believe that they've felt that too. And that's extremely important. If they see a professional psychologist who's done this for, 25, 30 years, unfortunately I won't tell you exactly how many years I've done this, but it's higher than that. They may not understand that I can relate to that problem in the same way that a fellow student could. And I think that's an invaluable piece to this program.
I want to go back to taking care of the peers. I think I had a whole slide with capital words on it. No, right? Boundaries. So if you haven't seen Brene Brown or Brene Brown's work, I would encourage you to YouTube her or read one of her books. But taking care of yourself, that's an essential part of that skill. And when can you say no, and how can you say no? We role-played some ways that you can say no. Also in the process, we are meeting monthly with that embedded psychologist so that you can kind of consult and use that in a way. If you're feeling overwhelmed, I would hope that you reach out to that embedded psychologist and let them know, and maybe we can turn you off the intakes or do whatever we need to do.
I add, there's a lot of teamwork involved, the way we approach it in our annual training. So camaraderie amongst the peer support volunteers, leaning on each other, talking to each other, of course maintaining confidentiality. There is a lot of emotional strain if you're really invested in certain of these calls. We're looking at giving time off, a couple months off, where there's no new cases to the PSVs. And also we have access to our mental health professional. The company has bought into paying, it's 50-50 split from the union and the company. So we do recognize that sometimes the PSVs need access.
And
Part of our training is a whole 45-minute module on self-care, because burnout is a real thing and you need to monitor yourself. And sometimes when you're the one under stress, you don't think you are, you don't see it, but others do. So that's a really key module in our training program.
And to echo off all the points that have been said, you know, we have a great group of peer supporters. We've been kind of developing this process for, you know, a few months now. And just having that cohort of people who are in the similar situation, who've been through similar trainings, not necessarily similar backgrounds, right? I'm proud that everybody in our program has a different background and can help different people, but having a group of people that all kind of knows what's going on, and you know, the situation that you're in is really invaluable.
So as we all know, aviation is a global industry, and we've been lately seeing in our institution and even here in UND that there's a lot of international students that are coming in. Is there things that we can do for the international students and support them? Because, you know, there are many boundaries with the international students, whether it's, you know, language, culture, you know, identity. Like, what is something that we can do as a global community to help these international students in their times of need?
Mm-hmm. Comment?
I'm going to answer this question as an Indigenous provider. I am Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and so I'm not international, but I am Indigenous, and so I know what it means to come from a world that doesn't quite fit. I also know what it means as a provider who treats a large number of Indigenous people, and what it has meant to them to have someone within their culture. We're not always going to have someone in your culture to do the good work. I know that, they know that, it is what it is. Here at UND, all students who are paying student fees have access to the counseling center. So the resources for UND students don't change, even for international students. Cultural competency, again, these aren't magic pills. We want, like, there's just to be like, oh, there's a magic pill. These are the same basic skills that we go back to over and over again. Staying curious and listening. If I can stay out of judgment, even that international student who probably has a lot of different experiences than I do will still hopefully feel heard and understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, at the airline level, we do a lot of networking with our peers in the country groups. I know Quay mentioned Air New Zealand. In 2009, FedEx had a fatal accident in Narita, Japan, and we called on our JAL, or Japan Airline counterparts, to help with our ramp agents and our local Japanese workers to be their peer, because as Americans, we probably weren't really set up to be really good critical incident response peers for them, and we really recognize that. So the networking that's available for the work we do, and it doesn't matter if you're unionized or in our union or no union, we all network at this level without those sort of political barriers. And just know that when you get to this level, you'll have that international support.
Question?
This is mainly about Uplift. How do you get students to sign up, and how do you retain them over the years to be a peer supporter?
So initially we were worried about how many people would be interested, especially because it was a brand new program. So we did a lot of advertising in the platforms that we thought a lot of students would be aware of already. We talked in a lot of different classes among a lot of different majors. So we really tried to make at least every aerospace student aware that they could apply to this. And I can't speak as much to retention because this is the first semester, but I know that we wanted to make it available for students to maybe take a break if they thought it was getting overwhelming, or maybe they have a stage check coming up, so that it didn't feel like a job where they would just get burnt out. They would have time to recuperate and come back to it when they're ready.
Yeah, so I can speak from kind of the personal numbers that we had. So when we started, we had 15 peers. One left due to personal reasons. He couldn't quite manage the workload, which is perfectly fine. Take care of yourself first. But on the flip side of that, I've had far more people interested in joining the program than people who have left because they're overwhelmed. So I'd say that especially I'm super happy with my classmates, my grade have been more than supportive and more than enthusiastic about staying on such a program and being a peer supporter. So it's not really a problem that we struggle with so much. But as far as retention goes, I've touched on it before. We only have 2-3 years. So I mean, Adrian, a training institution's purpose is to train, so we'll always be bringing in new peers as we go. But as far as enthusiasm goes, I've not seen that drop at all. Yeah, they were strictly volunteer.
And if I may just broaden that out to other peer support programs, and I don't know if you find the same thing, but whenever we recruit, our biggest issue is turning people down, because we often end up with a pool of people, far greater than we can train, who would be excellent peers. So that's the hardest one, is to explain to somebody, you were perfect, you were great. Just there were 10 other people who were just a little bit more perfect than you. And that's a tough one, they've invested quite a lot. But the follow-up question you asked about the volunteers, that's really important for us, is that there needs to be no obvious secondary gain. Now, particularly in an airline, with somebody's employed, there could be perceived a secondary gain that you get time off, that your sort of rosters are deducted and all the rest. And the peers would tell you they put far more time, even if that was the case, they put far more time in than they'd ever be compensated for. But it's really important that it is a voluntary basis, so that people are doing it for the right reason.
Even the leadership is volunteer. We don't get paid. Well, we get our pilot pay. I don't.
I do have one more thing. I started it and I was graduating that semester. There were a couple other students that helped me. One is studying abroad this semester, so he also left, and we got replaced by 15 people. So just to speak to the retention, our numbers increase, and hopefully they will increase along as time passes.
Time for one last question from the dean. So this is for you.
All right. So I do want to talk about one of the ideas that comes up for other universities is how do you pay for things, right? And so one of the things we do have to recognize, we have not recognized yet, is John Hauser himself. Mm-hmm. So we had hoped that his parents were going to join us for this summit. They're not able to. But when John passed away, his parents set up an endowment fund. And initially they thought it was just going to be them donating $10,000 or whatever it was. That fund has grown to an endowment, and it supports specifically mental health and aviation initiatives at UND, which allows us to put on this event, allows us to pay for some of the people to come, to pay for the support for some of this, but in particular, it's supporting the Uplift program.
I have an easy question. It is so impressive that you guys, on top of your flying duties and your classes, that you guys have worked so hard on this really remarkable program. So it's really extremely impressive. And to be leaders to your peers, to be the face of this program and stand up and say this is really important. So, hats off to you. Have you thought much about how you might take these skills from building this program and this experience to your aviation careers in the future, and what this might mean for next steps?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel very deeply about, mental health in the aviation industry. So, being able to start that here and kind of take it through along my journey at, in the aviation industry is incredibly important to me. I think that the main thing for me is just getting people to understand, how important mental health is in the aviation industry. And that's kind of a goal of this program as well, is to kind of introduce people to that. So that's kind of, I guess, my answer to it. It might not be perfect, but that's what I got for you.
I just started my career, so still a little young. But yeah, I've definitely taken a lot of the stuff that I've learned so far into my new job. For my job, we all need medicals still, even though we're flying drones. So to retain our medicals, I've had people come up to me asking questions about do I need a special issuance for this? What's AMAS? How do I contact them? Last week I read someone's letter that they just sent to AMAS. So that was interesting. But just yesterday we got a EAP program. So it's good to see that stuff kind of get started and make sure that people are aware of how mental health applies to aviation.
Yeah, so I think I've already learned a ton doing this and setting up such a program, but I think something that hasn't really been touched on quite yet is every pilot starts in a situation like this. You start as a 16, 17, 18-year-old coming in, getting your private pilot license, and you're not only learning how to do a stall or how to do a steep turn, you're learning what's acceptable in the aviation world. You're learning what's reportable, what's a just safety culture look like. And if we have students who come and they, report their problems to a peer support program, you're going to see that echoed in the future. You're going to see a student go off to industry and be like, hey, do they have something like Uplift? Something I'm struggling with, do they have a program like that? And you're going to see, a ripple effect down the line if this proves to be successful in a collegiate setting. So I think that's, another hope as well, is that we're impacting the future of, mental health and what our generation is going to do when they enter the industry.
In closing, let me just say, I'm the new kid on the block, although I'm a longtime professional. And I have to tell you, what you just heard, I'm privileged and honored to work with.